All right, today we are tackling a huge historical puzzle. Seriously, it's one of the big ones. How did a handful of small nations tucked away on the western edge of Eurasia manage to basically take over the world? We're diving deep into the story of the Great Divergence, the period that really shaped the unequal world we're all living in today. So, I want you to picture the world back in the year 1500. The real centers of wealth, of power, of innovation. They weren't in Europe, not even close. They were in places like China, India, the Middle East. Europe was, frankly, a bit of a backwater. But then, you fast forward just 300 years to 1800, and the entire picture has flipped. Western Europe has rocketed ahead, both economically and militarily. So what on earth happened? How did this massive shift, what historians called the Great Divergence, actually go down? To get to the bottom of this, we first have to look at what got the ball rolling in the first place. The initial sparks that really lit the fuse for Europe's global expansion. And to give you a sense of the sheer scale we're talking about, think about this. In 1500, Europeans controlled maybe 7% of the planet's landmass. By 1775, that number had jumped to 35%. This wasn't some slow, gradual process. This was a seismic, world-altering takeover. So what made it all possible? Well, it was really a perfect storm of different factors all hitting at once. On the technology side, you had game changers like the magnetic compass and the caravel, this new type of ship that was way more maneuverable. Then you had this explosion of new knowledge, like the rediscovery of Ptolemy's ancient maps. But you also had some powerful motivations. There was this huge desire to cut out the middlemen and get direct access to Asian spices and African gold. And mixed in with all of that, especially in Spain and Portugal, was this intense leftover crusading spirit. And this new economic power, it didn't just stay in one place. Kind of hopped around Europe. The 1500s? That was the century of Spain and Portugal, getting insanely rich off silver from the Americas. But they couldn't hold on to it. In the 1600s, the Dutch, with their innovative business practices, made Amsterdam the financial center of the world. Then, by the 1700s, the whole center of gravity shifts again, this time to London, which really set the stage for the Industrial Revolution. But here's the thing. This expansion wasn't just being driven by kings and queens. A totally new and incredibly powerful player entered the game. The state-chartered colonial company. You could think of them as the world's very first multinational corporations. Just look at the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. This was not your average trading business. It was basically a state within a state. The Dutch government handed it a complete monopoly on all trade in Asia and gave it the power to act like its own country. It could raise its own armies, wage wars, sign treaties. It could do pretty much whatever it wanted. It's this incredible example of how commercial and military power were fused together. And why would you pour your life savings into a risky venture like this? Simple. The profits were absolutely astronomical. The VOC paid out an average dividend of 18%. That completely dwarfed the 5 to 10% you might get from a normal investment. This kind of return pulled in massive amounts of money, which then created this feedback loop that financed even more expansion. All that profit created these huge pools of capital looking for the next big thing. And that capital helped build an even larger and far more brutal global machine, the Atlantic triangular trade. It worked like this. European ships would take manufactured goods to Africa, trade them for enslaved people, and then force those people across the Atlantic in the horrific Middle Passage. The survivors were then sold into slavery in the Americas to produce raw materials like sugar and cotton, which were then shipped back to Europe, closing the triangle. The sheer scale of this forced migration is it's hard to even wrap your head around. We're talking about 11 to 12 million Africans being captured and shipped to the Americas over these centuries. And you can see the overwhelming majority were sent to the Caribbean and Brazil, mostly to work on brutal sugar plantations. This slave-based economy was the absolute engine of the Atlantic world, and it generated staggering wealth that flowed back to Europe, fueling its incredible growth. This era also saw the birth of modern finance as we know it, stock exchanges, speculation, and of course, bubbles. It got so wild that even Sir Isaac Newton, one of the smartest people who ever lived, got sucked in and lost an absolute fortune in the South Sea bubble of 1720. His quote here just perfectly captures the high-risk, chaotic, and totally unpredictable vibe of this new capitalist world. Okay, so we've seen how Europe expanded its reach, but that brings us right back to the central mystery. Why? Why did this all happen? Why Europe and not somewhere else? This puzzle is often called the Needham question. It's named after a scholar, Joseph Needham, who dedicated his life to documenting China's incredible history of scientific and technological achievements. And his question was simple. Given that China was so innovative for so long, why didn't the Industrial Revolution happen there first? When you really dig into it, historians trying to answer this question tend to fall into two big camps. You've got the accidentalists, who basically argue that Europe just got lucky. It was a happy accident of geography and resources. Then you have the gradualists, who believe Europe's advantage wasn't an accident at all. It was slowly and purposefully built over hundreds of years through its unique culture and political institutions. So let's break down those arguments. The accidentalists, the luck camp, they point to some really concrete stuff. For example, Britain just happened to have huge coal deposits right near the surface and close to rivers, which was perfect for powering the first steam engines. Plus, they had the massive windfall of the Americas, a whole continent of resources that China just didn't have access to. But the gradualists, they look at what was happening inside Europe. They'll point to things like the Protestant work ethic, this idea that working hard and reinvesting your profits was a sign of God's favor. Or they'll talk about Europe's system of constant competition between states, which drove military and financial innovation. And they'll also highlight the slow development of things we take for granted now, like property rights and patent laws, which gave people a real incentive to invent things. So what about China then? Well, one of the most interesting theories is something called the high equilibrium trap. The basic idea is that China's economy before all this was actually so good, so successful and efficient, that it created a problem. It had highly productive farming and a very stable government. And because things were working so well, there wasn't a strong push for the kind of radical, disruptive, revolutionary change that you needed to kickstart an industrial revolution. In a weird way, China might have been a victim of its own success. So, let's pull it all together. What does all of this history actually mean for us right now? Well, these few centuries laid the literal foundations of the global economic system we all live in today. And in the end, it really doesn't seem like it was just one thing. Most historians today would say it was a combination of all of it. You can think of it like a recipe. You needed the lucky ingredients, the right geography, a few historical accidents. But you had to mix those with the institutions that were built up slowly over time, like competing states, scientific inquiry, and property rights. You put all of that together, and only then do you get the conditions for the Industrial Revolution to finally ignite. So, can we call this the first era of globalization? It's a really interesting debate. On the one hand, yeah, for the first time, the entire globe was connected by trade routes. But on the other hand, a lot of that trade was just in luxury goods. It was dominated by monopolies and held back by mercantilist policies where countries just wanted to hoard wealth. For the average person on the planet, life was still incredibly local. And that really leaves us with a final and pretty heavy question to think about. The Great Divergence created this massive, long-lasting gap between the West and the rest of the world. So as we look at our world today, we really have to ask, how much of the global inequality we see is a direct legacy of that unique, messy combination of luck, exploitation, and innovation that happened all those centuries ago?